Hey everyone, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, a podcast recorded on Gael Muggle land by me, Liam Miller, he, him, his, a minister in the Uniting Church in Australia. Love, Rinse, Repeat is part of the Uniting Mission and Education family, and we're excited to be supporting their work in vital leadership and promoting down, look below in the show notes, their upcoming Preach Fest festival, which is looking very exciting. My guest today is Melissa Florer-Bixler, who joins us for, I think, the third time on the podcast. Melissa, welcome along.
Thanks. It's so good to be with you again, Liam. Thanks for having me back again.
Oh, always a pleasure. And so I'm glad to be talking. We're talking today about your new book, How to Have an Enemy. Folks might also know Melissa as the author of Fire by Night and just from her wonderful online presence. So, you might have come across her work before, but How to Have an Enemy is you can all pre-order now, is what I was trying to say. So as you listen to this, I'm sure you'll be excited to open up another tab and do that if you haven't already. So Melissa, we're going to talk about the book. And I guess, we probably start at the crux of the matter. You write at one point, no good comes from the denial of enmity. So this is a book about how to have an enemy, which I guess assumes a few things, and perhaps, most notably, that we should have enemies, I guess is one of the assumptions. Sure. You write here that Jesus does not call us to claim we no longer have enemies. Instead, he shows us how to have the correct enemies and how to have them well. Without enemies, there can be no call to love them. Now, I think in some ways, this necessity of an enemy might come as a shock to some, or at least the idea that there are specific enemies and not just kind of this broad concept that could be out there potentially. So let's just start really the basic thing of, why is it important for the Christian to have enemies and have them well?
Yeah, one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book was because I come from a tradition, Mennonite Church USA, where we think we have a hard time articulating this sort of question. How do you love your enemies? And then it's sort of there's a whole list of steps or things that you're supposed to do. And I don't want to diminish those. I think they're really beautiful and helpful. But the question before, how do you love your enemies, is who are your enemies? And so if you try to answer that question in a vacuum, you actually can't love people in the way that they are meant to be loved. In some ways, it's both an assumption that there's a category out there of people that that either we disagree with, we don't get along with, that there's something amiss here. We don't really want to name that relationship because there's something that feels reiterative maybe about that, and just further ensconces us in enmity. So we jump to these sort of next steps for what we do. And so I really wanted to ask the question that was before, how do I love my enemy? And I think it's all over the Bible, right? I think the Bible is very clear that there are enemies. Yes. And so the discomfort that we have inherited from is coming from somewhere else in ways that I think are actually not always bad. I think that the anxiety about enmities actually makes sense in our world today. But that's not enough of a reason to say, oh, we're just not going to talk about this.
Yeah, that's great. So the book goes and, is addressing a few different things with the way, I guess, enmity is obscured or that shirking of that we should be able to name our enemies. And we'll come to a bit of that as we go on, but I'm interested in the place that you start, which is the infamous, notorious, oft-lauded Christmas Day truce of World War I. So most people should know this. You've seen Joanna well, you've seen this story. I think it's fairly widely known about this Christmas Day, both sides laying down their weapons and coming together to celebrate, and then the story goes from there. So talk about starting there, and I guess the way you see this as the Christmas Day truth as a myth aimed at kind of perpetuating a certain understanding of enmity as I guess overcome through interpersonal connection, which is a very common claim.
Sure. Yeah. So something I learned about that story, reading more about it, because like you said, it is ubiquitous. I've preached on that story before. Who among us has not, right? It's just a beautiful story about reconciliation and what's possible when when enemies are willing to cross the line. And I think I think what we like about that story is that it makes it seem really easy, right? Like, oh, if we only could see, if there was only a truce in the world, we could find our way to one another and things would change. And so it was kind of shocking to me to find out that the next day, they went back to enemy lines, or they went back to their own camps and started shooting at each other again. Like, this was not this was certainly an important moment in the lives of these soldiers, but nobody was punished for this. It wasn't like there was we're leaving our arms behind and we're going to try something new. And in some ways it's interesting because this story has been told, well, as I was doing this research, discovering all these other stories about World War I, where socialists and communists and other radical groups, even groups of soldiers, were really doing this daily, intensive work to end the war. We're absolutely critical of the imperialism behind the war. There were actually soldiers who at one point refused to fire on an enemy ship out of conviction, right? It wasn't because they met someone and it changed their mind. There were all these political movements that happened. And so the question for me is, continue to be, why is that story so significant for us, but we don't tell the stories of the socialist movements against imperialism, right? Because there's something political about that, because it has to do with systems, because it's long and messy and complicated. And it's saying that friendship isn't enough to dismantle enmity. You actually have to pay attention to the entire way that enmity is built into this program of war. And until you do that, the rest of these things are just going to be sort of a nod to sort of the way that we wish things could be.
Yeah, definitely. And so you kind of take that like idea of that, that interpersonal connection, that outreach kind of thing, from that kind of Christmas Day truce into kind of contemporary US context of police holding kind of community get to know you things, where they'll be at McDonald's and give out vouchers to the youths. And the idea is that, I guess, having met one another, that will mean the next time there's a fraught situation, that this pre-existing relationship or pre-existing goodwill or trust that is believed to have been engendered will mean that sees a different outcome. And again, you point out that this again is completely allied in the fact that of a huge power differential, of a structure and a system which essentially sets the result, regardless of the interpersonal stuff. So I guess, I'm just curious there about you're kind of talking about how often that a lot of that empathetic focus on community building or reconciliation just completely ignores power differentials and the very structures that hold those powers. So talk to us a little bit about that move, and I guess, that real important attention to power differential when if we're going to try to talk about enmity.
I think the way that we think about empathy is at the heart of a lot of these sort of attempts to overcome conflict or to do reconciliation if we were involved in each other's lives. This is very much the narrative that comes out in the language of reconciliation. It begins with personal relationships, and that's just actually really complicated. Surely that is true some of the time, right? But as we see in this example that I talk about, that you just shared again, in these, the cops doing the funny dance outside of, the school, or an example that we just had in the US of police showing up to a small town Black Lives Matter and this really beautiful moment of the town and the Black Lives Matter approach, and the cops all coming together and marching together. And 6 weeks later, that one of these police officers shows up at the January 6th Capitol riot, right? Like, so empathy is a tool. It is useful. It is psychologically real, and it's useful. And the police utilize empathy to create goodwill. They know how to utilize empathy. I know how to utilize empathy. I want people to understand that people in prison are not the worst thing that they have ever done. I utilize empathy all the time. And it is a complicated and fraught way to establish a political identity. It can be useful. And it's also just very complicated. But we continue to live in a world, and I think especially in a church, where empathy is seen as a natural good, instead of that there's actually a politics to empathy. Like empathy can actually be, it's not neutral. It can be utilized in both directions. And it isn't quite the, I'm trying to come up with like a sports metaphor, and I'm not like great at sports, like the hitting the home run. Yeah. That's what I'm looking for. It doesn't quite do that in the way, because if that's all it took, we would not live in the world that we live in now. Like if someone had already figured out that if we just got people in the room and understood each other's stories, like we just wouldn't be in the position we are in now. And so I want us to make space for actually thinking about the politics of power among us, rather than making these, jumping to the assumptions that I actually think can be incredibly damaging to people who are not at the center of that power.
That's really helpful. And so I think that might be a nice way to kind of dovetail into the way the church kind of often operates in this way, in particularly how it thinks about, again, that kind of thing of, well, isn't it a great thing if we can have people from the right and the left or the center or the whatever words we're going to use in that situation often, and they can be together and they can be unified and they can see each other and they can connect over, whether it's over small talk or whether it's over the proclamation of Jesus is Lord, but by that we have connected, and that's this kind of lauded, a lauded community, a lauded value that we have. As a side note, I thought it's always like the commendable is that you kind of somehow have just, a bit of right of center to basically a bit of left of center or to center. It's never like, hey, my church manages to hold together Marxists, Leninists, and anarchists, and we hold. It's like, and from my days of student politics, that is the harder, space to hold. But still, this idea that that's what we should be, celebrating and connecting and patting ourselves on the back. But again, one of the things you point out is often those groups that we have unified, even if there is a bit of a political divide, usually share power, the same amount of power in their society or their community or neighborhood. And so thus it is very easy to kind of have this unity. And if anything, as you say, it actually then becomes this kind of dangerous thing in that it's really, it's creating it's ignoring where the actual power matters, right. why the divisions in politics matter, right? Yeah. Do you want to just talk a little about, kind of breaking down that kind of belief that the best church is one that can somehow exist across the party lines, as it were?
Yeah, it's just such an interesting fiction to me. I want to know, like, who came up with that? What's the, I'm always interested in just like the genealogy of these things, because they're so, like you said, you sort of say this jokingly, but this is true for my congregation. I've got like Occupy Wall Street people and Marxist people and Antifa people, and then like a very big Joe Biden supporter. And I'm like, good for me for holding this together, quite honestly. And then like Mennonites who were like kind of apolitical, like who decided like that the range of of difference that matters is an import of the party systems from our political world. Like it just, the only guess that I have about why we are so invested in that is because a model of polarization that presents two equidistant from center sides who have extremes, right? We have the far left and the far right in the US. And the people who really benefit from breaking up the world that way are centrists. Right? The people who benefit from, because they end up getting to say, oh, we're the only grown up in the room, right? Like we are the only ones who can think rationally and are accepting. And what I don't think people realize is that is a politic. Like that is a political decision that you make to moderate two views when one may be good and one may be bad on different things. So for instance, I was working on this lecture that I'm giving on polarization, and one of the exercises we're doing is for people to identify where on the political spectrum in the US you would put a few statements. And one of those statements is racism is real and affects people's everyday life. And I'm guessing that a lot of people are going to say that's a left to pretty far left position. It is just true. It is just true. There's no far right. Like if you say racism does not affect people's everyday life, you're just bringing in something that's not true. And so you're asking people to moderate the centrist between something that's not true and something that's true, which does not make any sense for us. That is not the kind of life that we are trying to live. And so this is, where we get into the church, and when we start to try to moderate these positions, or when the church thinks that it's the only grown-up in the room, the only person who really is dispassionate enough to be able to sort of bring everybody together, not everybody bears that weight in the same way. It is people who have little control over their lives, who have been subjected to racist and homophobic and classist socioeconomics. Those are the people who actually have to bear the burden of unity. If you're the person who already gets to decide things, then all you're doing is making some sort of conceptual space for other people to come along. But if you still control how everything happens, what are you actually being asked to give up in the midst of that? And so whenever people, the question I always want to ask is, who is asking for unity? That's I want to know who that person is and what it is that is behind, what do they really want? And until I can get that question answered, I feel a little skeptical.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And so one of the things you talk about with unity then is that the movement of Jesus Christ is not seeking a unity across, right and left, but those who are, have been called out of the old principalities and powers and are participating in their destruction and the seeking of a, abundant life for all. Like that is what it should be grounded on. So it's okay to say this church does not stand for certain positions, but denials, etc. We are out and out about this, and you can have a range of views on X, Y, and Z, but this is what we're about, and that's okay. So yeah, I guess I'm curious about that, and trying to think about how that looks and how you kind of have seen that working in your own ministry and things like that, of that going this is this is the unity kind of that we should be appealing to, not one that makes us would look nice on whatever Meet the Press, but is about actually, well, I guess we're saying it's about something. It's a unity for a purpose that goes beyond comfort.
Yeah, and this is where I love that the image that Paul uses, and I think I talk about this in the book, that the image for the church is not a static object. It isn't a house. It isn't a tree. It is a body. Like a body moves and acts in the world. Like if you had a body that didn't like love and enjoy and act and have friendships, we would consider that an impoverished life, one that we want people to have those things, right? So this idea that that we do things, that feels really significant to me, that Paul intentionally chose that metaphor. We are trying to do something here, and that thing is to participate in the endless reign of God that begins in this life and extends forever. To graciously step in to this world that has been freed from the socioeconomic, heteronormative, racist forms of violence and destruction that bind this world. And somehow through the great joy of participating in God's work among Israel, Gentiles like me get to be a part of that. And that is and so to reduce that to, well, we're gonna just listen to all the opinions in the room, or we're just not going to talk about politics. It just feels like such a sad and unfortunate way to live when this real gift of living a redeemed life together has been offered to us.
Yeah, thank you for that. So that I was thinking about, and this might be a very mainline thing, but when I was being trained into be a minister, a lot of what you're asked to do is are you going to be able to minister to people who don't believe the same as you, right? In terms of political things or theological things. And it's interesting, I often thought about what is to minister to doing in that context, right? Because I think in a lot of times it's about are you able to do be present to people and cater to people in such a way they feel they can stay, regardless if they believe something else. Whereas, I think to minister, you could answer that yeah, absolutely, I'm ready to minister to those people by calling them out of the death cults in which they participate. There's, and I definitely know of in my formation of ministers in our church saying yeah, my congregation don't know what I think about important topic X, because if they did, then they'd know I wasn't it would be harder for some to know that I was their minister, those kind of things. Sure. And so that was in my head when I read these two quotes from your book, which is, my work in the church is not to soften strong beliefs or shelter oppressive ideology under the guise of our oneness in Christ. Instead, we carve out a common life within the good news of Jesus' redemption. And as a pastor, I don't see it as my role to create a politically diverse church where people share their ideas dispassionately in an attempt toward middle ground or mutual transformation. So I guess thinking about, the role not only of the church, but as those called to lead within the church, whether ordained or lay, or what have you, that, there's that pastoral care, or that the care of the souls and bodies of those within our midst doesn't necessarily mean that we try to make everyone be able to stay, right? Or make accommodations for all, or that kind of thing. But, it's about this, pulling people out of something into something, which necessarily means some people won't want to stay, and that being fine. So yeah, and I guess almost in a way being able to name the way that people within our communities are complicit in enmity, are complicit in violence towards others in our congregation or in our neighborhoods. So just thinking a bit about that, about, again, the church, about your role within the church as a leader, and how that looks, that pastoral care can be tinged with discomfort. Yeah.
I think that's true. I think there are certainly, yeah, and I use a lot of I language because I know everybody's in a, in a unique position. And so, I hope this book offers, it's for all these books are the starting point for conversations that we're having in our own context, right? And so for me, in my context, it's really important to be, to create a safe space for LGBTQ people. And to be really clear about that, that if people who are the bearers of heteronormative power want to come in and bully or harm people in my church, we just don't have space for that. You don't have to believe everything that we believe, but we do want to create a space that is nourishing and nurturing for people who have been harmed, which feels really significant for us. And there, and I think that we also, I hear pretty often pastors who tell me, oh, my church could never have done that event, or we could never have raised bail to get someone out of ICE detention. And I just think like, yeah, maybe you're on this longer journey, and that's okay. Like, be on that journey. Like, maybe you got appointed to go somewhere. You don't need, this is, we're all working with what we've got. But that is a very different thing from saying sort of what we were talking about before, that that the goal of our church is to really find ourselves in a place where we can leave all the stuff behind that not everybody agrees on, because at the end of the day, that's often what happens. We can't really be a sanctuary church because we actually, half our church thinks that if you got into this country as a child without papers, that you should be deported in your 40s. Like, that's not a good place to be as a congregation. And if you can't say that about, at least within yourself, then that feels like it's going to also be really hard for pastors, right? Because I also hear this all the time, that I don't think that bishops and other people who call ministers to these churches recognize of, like, actually the kind of harm to the self that occurs from constantly having to feel like you're skirting the important work of the gospel because you know that you've been in a position to fail in some ways, that breaks my heart for clergy who find themselves put in that position, oftentimes with no support, oftentimes underpaid. This is your job. You've got kids, like, you don't have a chance. You can't quit or move on to something else. So this isn't just about like, suck it up and like get in there and do your thing, right? We also need to have like the support systems, and to actually have people in leadership of our churches say, what's it like to be a woman at this church where half the people don't think women should be pastors? Happens to Methodists all the time. And I'm just like, how could you live a healthy, full life if you're in that role? So again, there's all these systems around this, and we have to stop lifting this up as like a natural assumed good for our churches.
Thank you. So I was thinking about how, like, people often kind of talk about, I was in a conversation with someone the other day, we were both in a kind of ministry context where there's large numbers of poor or people in temporary housing or a lot of poverty. Then there's kind of maybe new influx of the area becoming gentrified. And then there's kind of a mix of a third group often who are kind of have been there a long time, aren't quite as poor, but aren't quite as rich, somewhere in the mid, And we were kind of talking about how, like, how do you be when you're set to be a church like that, it's very difficult to think about a way that you would be church that appeals aesthetically or, programmally to all those groups. And, maybe you have to pick. And it was just a random conversation. And we were talking a bit about how, in some ways, is the church one of those few spaces that individuals from those three groups actually come together and all that. And now sometimes we stop there and go and say that kind of, and that's great because of that empathy we were talking about before, that the church has this space because it's a free public space, because it doesn't have to produce profit in the same way, more than a cafe can, more than, your local, well, should I say leagues club? That might not have any translation, but local, whatever bar, whatever, the church has some capacity to do that better than some other places. But I'm also attentive to not wanting to stop at just that. We can theoretically be something that's for all people, but actually we're still wanting to really appeal to group A because they've got more money or whatever it might be. But I was definitely thinking about, you wrote this though, the church has the potential to create space for negotiation, power analysis, solidarities, our failure to attend to them, and then our repentance to those failures. In baptism, we come into full recognition of ourselves and of our place within the hierarchies and histories of our bodies bear, into the work of a renewed social order among us. And so I got to thinking, I wanted to ask, is there something that you think the church, maybe not uniquely, but is better positioned than a lot of other organization structures in our society to play in this work of recognizing enemies and of working towards dismantling abusive power structures and some form of repair, restoration, and reconciliation, without just kind of, because I think sometimes we go, yeah, the church is the best position to do this, and yet it doesn't seem to. But I'm curious about your thought of what specifically maybe you think the church can actually bring in this kind of context and conversation.
Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely think so. And, I think the axe feels like just the different stories being told over and over again of exactly the situation you're describing, right? We have these women who are like maybe talking too much and they're getting too much power, and these other people, and what do we do with them? And and then we've got this other church where like the poor people are showing up late and all the food's been eaten by all the rich people who don't have to work. And then like we have this, like it feels like the same story over and over and over again of people who are divided by social context, again, by that web of intersecting isms that sort of hold us in our social places. And the church becomes the vehicle to create a community around those who bear the greatest burden of that in their social order. And so it does seem like that sort of, I still actually kind of like that language of downward mobility, that there is that sense of, it's the people who have made it, who are constantly being asked and asked to divest themselves. It's the weak who we need to be setting up our lives for. Don't eat before these workers get here. Like, what are you doing? Right? Look at this. And then even Jesus, this woman has given me more. You opened your house and hospitality to me, Simon, and this woman has given me more. She's wept for me, and you just like are trying to sign a social contract here. Like, I know what's going on. So we do, we have this story just over and over and over again. We know that for some communities, that's been really costly for them in the story of the church, right? That it's that at one point, I know one of the emperors was really threatened because the Christians were giving out so much charitable giving that it was making him look bad. And so it's like, so we have all of these stories of this materializing in the church. And it feels like this is sort of this way, like we can look into the windows of these churches and see that they're actually going through the same things that we are.
Yes, thank you for that. So one thing I can imagine people thinking is, when you start actually naming someone or some structure as an enemy, is this idea that, well, now you're now trying to obliterate them, or you're now denigrating them, or now you're, hey, they're probably also struggling with X, Y, Z. Which is why I think it's really important that the command is you're wanting to know your enemies so that you can love them, right? Because we believe that to be in a position where you are doing violence to people, you're caught up in this oppression and it is harming your soul, is harming who you are, is doing damage to you. Like I often talk about, how, as someone, living in the colony of Australia, and as someone who benefits from it, like I need, the critique needs to come, the redistribution of a society, the challenge and the breaking down of this needs to happen, because if not, it's so easy for me just to assume that I am, godlike and powerful, and that's my right to just walk into this. It is for my, so that I don't close off from those who are vulnerable and persecuted and dispossessed. It's this thing that loves me and draws me back toward Christ, and away from this self-sufficient whatever. And so you write in the book, we love our enemies when we extend an invitation to a form of life where those who have the power to destroy others no longer exercise the self-destruction of hatred, hoarding, and violence. So like it's one of those, that the classic of our mutual liberation is tied up together. People will get free from being, drawn out of their places where they have the power to oppress and to hoard and that. So I guess talk to us a little about that, like this idea that, that harsh critique, the harsh word, the calling someone an enemy, the calling someone complicit in this is a loving gesture. Because I think that's so important, because I think that's often why people hold back, right? Why they keep it as this kind of nebulous, undefined something out there, or reserve it only for the worst of the worst that we can all agree is that, that we don't want to be mean. But what we're saying is, no, it's not. It's the most loving thing you can do for someone caught up in this, is not to placate them, but to confront.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, please tell me if I am if I am living a life counter to the gospel of freedom. I want to know that. And most likely, I think one of the other gifts that the church offers, and talk a little bit about this in the chapter on discernment, is, if we actually really, if we do the things that with the, if we follow the sort of path that's been given to us by Jesus that we saw in the early church, we actually learn these things together. Like, this isn't a one and done, right? We are actually in this constant place of discernment about our lives and the new questions before us. And so it's not like there's anybody ever off the hook on this question. But it also makes space for us to be able to name when harm has been done. And so, we both have this ongoing process, but there's also, I think, again, an important honesty to being able to say, I have been harmed. My community has been harmed. A community I am in solidarity with has been harmed by this person. And to overlook that actually just feels kind of dishonest. Like, who are we really fooling by saying that we don't, I don't think anybody's actually I actually feel fine about Donald Trump, and I'm just not going to say anything out loud about it. And maybe if I don't say anything, anger doesn't go away. Like enmity doesn't go away just because you don't talk about it, right? That's, yes. And until you actually make space to be able to name that, to give that a form, then it's impossible to begin to do the work of saying, how did we get here? What needs to be changed for this relationship to change? And it's not just going to be interpersonal, because our our political lives are always personal, our personal lives are always political. So there's all these other things that have been set in motion around me that are also interpersonal. And so I can't really, all of this has to be taken apart together for us to be able to get in a place where we are both set free from this relationship of enmity. I don't think actually being enemies benefits anybody. Like it's not, I do think that one of the things that I think separates enmity from just say like a disagreement or someone you're upset with is that power differential. But that's actually not good for either party. It's not like one party's like doing great and the other one's doing badly, right? Like that's like, this is actually bad for both people.
Yes.
And so what it means to love our enemies is to actually change that situation so that we don't have to be enemies anymore. And that's not going to happen if we just pretend that everything's fine.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, because otherwise you think like the person who has the power, for whom everything is going great, it's then framed as, oh, it's this wonderful sacrificial thing that you have to do, or it's resisted because it's seen only as this thing I'm just having to give up all this that's by right mine. And it's like, no, man, you're getting free. Like this is for, for your salvation, for your ability to live in a flourishing, positive, constructive way in this world with your neighbors. Like it's not just that you're like benevolently stepping out. It's like, no, you're being called out by the same voice that called out Lazarus,
Yeah. And I think the other part about that is once we begin to have that conversation, we actually begin to see how you can really begin to see the complications of the intersections of these situations and people that we call enemies. So I think about ICE agents. Right. In the U.S., a lot of Border Patrol, part of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they recruit people from these small towns along the border where there's no other jobs, where there's these are jobs that don't necessarily require a lot of skills. They pay pretty well, and sometimes, and many times, they're people of color. And so you have like people who may be immigrants themselves being employed in this larger system that is more or less saying this is really the only job available to you to get through. And of course, people, of course, can, of good conscience, lay down, quit their jobs. But I think what's more important to say is this has been all of this has been structured, right? Like it has been structured in such a way that this job of breaking up families and neighborhoods and churches is being done by poor, often people of color in these small towns who have few other choices in this life. So to say like, yeah, you need to take responsibility. Like this is a terrible thing. And me just becoming friends with the ICE agent doesn't change that situation. Like I can talk to the ICE agent all day long. It is not going to change deportations. It's not going to change the system that makes it impossible for there to be other jobs in border towns. The only thing that's going to change that is the political will of people working to dismantle those systems.
Yes, that's a great point. I think I remember one time, I think it was you who was talking about like, church metrics and how do we measure our churches and like, we need to expand the categories to include like someone felt compelled to leave a job in which they were complicit in structures of abuse, and the church had raised money to support them while they were in that. Like it's like that's if that's not. I've got to do an annual minister's report soon, and that wasn't one of the categories. But like you feel like that those kind of how do we if we're thinking about that, we're trying to form this movement, we're trying to be this body in relating to our world and seeking this. Then we how we think about what. How we're succeeding or doing it well, needs to include considerations like this. Needs to like touch on these topics and these issues around us. I think Let's end with the family. So I think one of the things that's interesting you write is that sometimes to find redemption, to go to work against the principalities and powers requires us to make ourselves enemies of the community and even the family in which we were so lovingly rooted. As you say, renewed allegiances to those considered former enemies will strain, challenge, and potentially destroy kinship. It's us thinking about the enemy of my enemy is my friend, but then if you befriend the first enemy, then the friend is now the enemy. It's something, there's something there that, I probably need a visual aid to pull out. But I'd be interested to talk about that in terms of, the idea of the potential need to undo family ties in order to have the right enemies or to have enemies well. You don't have to necessarily go into, you just for those who are going to maybe get the book, hopefully there's a brilliant story at the beginning of this chapter that you can get into, or you can just say for those who are going to certainly buy the book and read. But yeah, just curious about, because I think this is one of those real rubber hits the road kind of points of, enmity and family and communities of belonging.
Yeah, I know that we are often presented a narrative of the naturalness of the family, the current capitalist iteration of the nuclear family, family first, like all I have is family, right? Like these are like phrases we hear all the time. Blood is thicker than water, right? Like these are, this is a pretty constant cultural artifact that exists in a lot of the Western parts of the world. And so, when we encounter the Gospels and Jesus saying, actually, I'm gonna draw a sword in your family between mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, and between father and child. This can feel really shocking for us because it's back to that. It feels very personal, right? Yes. And so what I sort of wanted to think again a little less about just the interpersonal, which I think we just largely, like at the end of the day, you're like, okay, Jesus, like I've still got to like take these kids to school tomorrow. Like I don't know what to tell you, right? Like, but thanks. But what if we actually begin to think a little bit more about how economic structures our families, the people to whom we pass down private property, who do we pay for them to go to school? How do we treat singleness in our communities? And who are we responsible for as they age and as they participate? Is there, as other people are not available to help with the aging process? Like all of these are actually economic questions at the end of the day, right? They're not interpersonal questions. And so it might be really offensive to find out that that money was left to somebody else's family and not to you, right? Or if we didn't have private property anymore, that was made to pass down to the next generation. Like all of these things are the kind of thing I think Jesus had in mind, because right, family is, especially in the ancient Roman world, it really was much more explicitly a form of economics than I think we are comfortable admitting. We do not like that, right? Like we want families to be like places of nurture and respite and care, unless you have just been a mom who's been through the pandemic. And like, we all know that like all the moms, like we're suddenly like, wait, what's going on here? Right. And so moments like this actually are like, oh, this is embedded in the system too. Jesus was aware of that. And so we need to be attentive to those systems of family that we participate in.
Yes. I think as you say, it's often assumed as a natural, benevolent, good thing. And that then means that if we attach certain economics to the family, such as the passing down of property, then that itself becomes now, by the transitive property, a benevolent, natural good. But obviously, that then leads to systems of great generational inequality and the like. So being able to talk about, to see that, as you say, it's that constant ongoing discernment of how is this at play in this system of power imbalance and disparity in our society, which I think is helpful in the sense that it takes it from, not that this isn't an important part of that conversation, but it takes it from, do I still talk to my uncle even though he's like a rabid Trump supporter? Like, it's like, that's a question that one has to discern. But if it's only ever that question and not how the whole thing is enwrapped in this, is then it's not going to go, as you say, it's not going to achieve what you need to achieve.
Who are we responsible for, and who is responsible for us, right? That actually changes those questions. You know, if you have people in your life who are harmed by Trump's policies, then you have to, like, do you speak up about this, or is it, family first, right? And so I do, so there really are these, I think, intersecting questions for us, but I'm not really, I'm not very prescriptive. Like, I don't really I don't want to tell you what to do. I just try to tell some stories from the Bible and kind of tell you what I do. And hopefully some of it's helpful, parts it's not. Don't worry about it.
Well, that's great.
It's also helpful for somebody.
A resounding, unequivocal endorsement for the book, and it's which is great. So the book is How to Have an Enemy. It is coming out sooner than you know. I was going to say in weeks, but I'm not sure how long until this interview goes up. So I'm like, I don't want to lead people astray. But you can pre-order it now, which is obviously very good for any number of reasons that help Melissa, that help her publisher. So pre-order and tell your friends, and get Fire by Night if you haven't already. And Melissa, do you want people to follow you online at all?
Yes, I try to be on my best behavior, but it's a hard medium for me. So I'm doing the best I can. But feel free. If you need a break from me every once in a while, it's totally fine too.
No, that's great. Well, thank you. That Melissa's hand will be in the show notes. Thank you for joining us today. Anything else you want to shout out? Any final things you want to leave us with?
Oh, it's just so good to see you again, Leah.
Yeah. I think the last time we spoke was back just really early in the pandemic, and I was like, maybe I'll do a couple of specific episodes about this, just to tide us over for the next month or two while things are a bit strange. Whoa.
Oh my gosh, here we are a year later. Good to see you.
And you. Thank you for joining us today, and folks, we'll see you next week.